I wanted to start our discussion right now on the executive branch. What I wanted to look at more specifically was this question: what powers are granted to the president, and how and why have those powers expanded over time? Before we get at the specific powers granted to the president in the Constitution, I wanted us to take a look at where some of those ideas stem from. First of all, Federalist 70 tells us a lot about that, and that is one of your foundational documents. His first sentence here: energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. This is the start of his Federalist 70, and it makes a bold claim for a powerful presidency. He also makes the argument, though, for a lifetime term for the presidency and a singular executive. There were a number of others, though, at the time as well that vehemently opposed him on these charges. They argued for the need for an executive branch led by committee. They also and challenged him on the boldness of the powers and the purpose of those bold powers as well. But Hamilton did win on some key areas, and that is a singular executive. So while he didn't get the lifetime terms, much of what he argued for has continued to expand as America's role in the world has continued to expand. But before we get further, let's look at the formal powers of the presidency. And there are three main clauses that I want us to pay attention to in this specific video, and that is the president's power as commander-in-chief, his power in making sure that the laws are faithfully executed, which is called the Take Care Clause, and his power in appointing officials. Now, there are a variety of other powers that I want to touch on briefly here, though, as well, and that is granting pardons. Any person that is convicted of a crime at the federal level can have his record fully removed and be brought out of prison as well for that. That's what it means to have that ability to grant pardons. That's anyone that he can grant there. Trump has challenged that, and there are some questions about some of that pardoning power, but as of yet, that power remains pretty darn expansive. It's also important to remember that he can veto and approve legislation as in his role as legislative leader, which is a very key power. But in addition to the formal powers, folks, there are also the informal powers. And many of you spoke about these in your latest FRQ, about his powers to bargain and persuade Congress members. Remember to be clear on what that bargaining and persuasion means. How does he go about that? Where does he go about that? When does he go about that? He can issue executive orders. They can issue signing statements there, and also negotiate executive agreements. Just to clarify, an executive agreement, it's a lot like a treaty. So much like an executive order has the force of law, an executive agreement has the force of a treaty without the need for that congressional approval. The president has a bit more flexibility, but there are some limits. And that is, Congress can create a new treaty or a new law that the president can sign on or not, or they can simply reject those actions, and the courts can challenge that as well. But it is a pretty important power there. Now, we spoke about America's expansion into this global superpower status. But even before then, even before America became the behemoth that it is now, it's important to note that when that power really started to expand, this particular argument takes the stand that it expanded with FDR. Some, though, argue that it happened even earlier with the expansion under Theodore Roosevelt. But most agree that it is the New Deal during the Great Depression that significantly expanded that power. And after World War II, as the United States created an apparatus to try to challenge the Soviet Union, its wartime powers expanded significantly during that time as well. So both in terms of creating a social welfare state under Roosevelt's New Deal and later Johnson's War on Poverty with the Great Society, as well as these wartime powers and acts during the Cold War. And recognize that's a multi-decade thing. Now that the Cold War shifted into the War on Terror, many of those same powers continue, which is why the executive branch is so unbelievably enormous. The executive branch employs roughly 1% of the population. So about 3 million Americans work for one of these 15 cabinets of the presidency, or one of the many different executive agencies that are a part of these different cabinets there. That's absolutely huge. And recognize that the president is the boss of all of these folks. That doesn't mean that he can ultimately fire whomever he wants. We're going to take a closer look at bureaucracies later on, but that does mean that he has a great deal of authority in regards to who heads these various cabinets or agencies. But an important question to ask about all of these powers and expectations about the president is do we ask too much? We ask that the president keep us safe from terrorists. We ask our president to keep our borders well secured and well protected. We ask that our presidents help foster education. We ask that our presidents foster strong welfare systems. Where are those limits, though? Because recognize that whenever we grant the president the ability to carry out these various governmental actions, that does ultimately represent a strengthening of those powers and, to some, a weakening of our own liberties. Okay, a number of conservatives have made the argument that the larger the government, the smaller the individual. Now, regardless of your take on that, and of what sort of power the president should have, there are 7 main roles that the president needs to fulfill. Okay, and again, the ones that I'm paying especially close attention to now are legislative leader, commander in chief, but each of these play very important roles here. And I ask some important questions that I want you to think about. Every president has certain strengths in some of these areas more than others, but the weaker they are in one can end up costing them an election. The role that I want to zero in on right now is chief executive. And I would argue that this is one of the most important roles for one big reason. As I mentioned a moment ago, the president can determine who is the head of the 15 executive departments, as well as the head of the various agencies within those departments. They don't have as much control over the employees that are hired by those heads, but understanding that culture can be set at the top does a lot to shift the influence of those programs. Also, in being able to appoint federal judges, those terms are for life, folks. So this is an enormous power that the president has. Commander in chief, well, recently you guys learned about Trump's actions in Iraq that led to the death of a famed Iranian general, or a notorious Iranian general, depending upon your perspective. But the concern was whether or not that would lead to an act of war. Now, there are limits on this specific power that we'll be getting into in the next video, but it is important to note that this has an enormous amount of power, especially as America's presence has grown as much as it has internationally. Now, if the president can't get the support that he sometimes wants from Congress, he'll often turn to what is referred to as the bully pulpit. And the reason why it's called a bully pulpit is you and I can't simply call CNN and, for a press conference and expect a press crew to show up and give an announcement about the need for, say, absolving all student debt. We don't have that kind of authority. But if Trump wants to issue a tweet, it's going to have a powerful effect on a number of different Americans, from universities across the country to immigration and customs enforcement. And that plays a role in his influence over Congress. Again, if he feels that he can't get that support from Congress, but he can from the American people, many times the president will issue what's called an executive order. And just to clarify, an executive order has the force of law without the need of congressional support. There are some limits to these executive orders, again, that I'll be looking at in the next video, but that's a powerful way for the president to circumvent congressional authority. Other factors that influence presidential power are elections. Now, there's a mandate theory of government, and that is that if a president wins by a sizable margin in an election, that gives him a sweeping mandate. And what that means is whatever agenda that they ultimately wrote on, be it universal health care or be it stronger borders, Congress must ultimately support that agenda because of the wide margin in which they were elected. Trump also claimed that he had a mandate within the election of 2016. So the term has been used in a variety of different ways, but it is worth noting that a number of presidents believe in this theory and they go about operating differently with this theory in mind. Public approval has a lot to do with that as well, because elections for the presidency are only every 4 years. So I want you to think that if you are a Republican Congress member running for reelection in November this year, and a bit of legislation being forwarded by the Trump administration has come before your desk. You are a Republican, but you are in a purple district, which means that there are a number of Democrats in your district as well. Do you support Trump's administration with that legislation, recognizing that his disapproval ratings have been hiking up because of negative views of how he's handled COVID-19? All of those factors play a large part in what sort of power the president has and how he wields that power. I hope you found this video informative. Thanks for the time, everybody.